everyone! For our very last international spotlight in Europe, it only makes sense that we finish up with the largest European country, Russia. Russia has had a long and storied history that began thousands of years ago, like most European countries. But Russia developed into what it is today by following a completely different path than their European neighbors. Russia is a Slavic country, and not a lot is known about the Slavic people before the early Middle Ages. During the time of the Roman Empire, the Slavs were just described as Veneti, and were simply the people that lived east of the Germanic people in the north of Europe, and the Persians in the Far East. Again, not much is known of the Slavic people before the early Middle Ages. It was during the Middle Ages, however, that the Slavic people started settling in areas of Eastern Europe and started to be influenced by the Greek Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines sent missionaries to Slavic lands to convert the people there to Christianity, and as a result, most Christians in Slavic countries today are Eastern Orthodox Christians like those in Greece. The notable exception to this rule is Poland, where a vast majority are Catholic. Anyway, another consequence of Byzantine culture on that of the Slavs is their alphabet. While everyone in Western Europe uses the Latin alphabet, even those that do not speak Latin-based languages, like English, most Slavic languages use the Cyrillic alphabet, which was originally based off of the Greek alphabet. Anyway, the first great Slavic kingdom of Eastern Europe was simply called the Rus, with many outside of the kingdom calling it Ruthenia. This medieval kingdom was centered around the modern-day city of Kiev, Ukraine, and as such, it is often described as the Kievan Rus. Both the modern nations of Ukraine and Russia claim to be descended from the Kievan Rus, and there has actually been some disagreement between the two countries as to which country is the legitimate successor to the medieval kingdom. Anyway, in the middle of the 13th century, the power of Kiev was broken as Mongol warriors rode into Eastern Europe and conquered the land of the Rus. After this, the old principalities suddenly became vassals of the Mongols and not Kiev. The Mongol Golden Horde controlled Eastern Europe for over 250 years, and during that time, much of what would become Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were not considered to be European at all. At this point, many thought that Poland was the end of the European continent because much of what is now Eastern Europe had been conquered by people from Central Asia. Anyway, during the time of the Golden Horde, new cities were founded and started to grow in power and prestige. One such city was Moscow. For much of its early history, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, or Muscovy for short, was a vassal to the Mongol Empire. In 1480, however, under Grand Prince Ivan the Great, Moscow rebelled against the Mongols and became a completely independent country. Just over 60 years after the independence of Moscow, the once small duchy had spread out well beyond its former borders and soon became the largest country in all of Europe. In 1533, Ivan IV became the Grand Prince of Moscow, and in 1547, Ivan was proclaimed the Tsar, or Caesar, of Russia. Under Ivan, the Tsardom of Russia expanded out into Eastern Europe and conquered much of the former Mongol territory in Central Asia. Because he was able to expand into Central Asia and unify most of the Eastern Slavs under his rule, he earned the nickname Ivan the Terrible. While terrible today means evil or bad, at this time the word meant fearsome, not evil. So it would probably make more sense to call Ivan the Fearsome and not terrible. Anyway, after the reign of Ivan, Russia continued to expand eastward far into Asia and was even able to conquer more land from Eastern European powers like Poland. Around another 100 years after the death of Ivan, arguably the greatest Russian monarch came to power, Peter the Great. Peter was greatly influenced by the ideas of the West and the Enlightenment, and as such, he implemented a number of reforms throughout Russia. In addition to reforms of the nation as a whole, Peter also established the Russian Empire to replace the old Tsardom, and moved the capital of the country to St. Petersburg, a city in which he founded. Even though Peter implemented many reforms throughout his empire, the feudal system remained mostly intact in Russia, and serfs had little to no rights within the empire. Throughout all of this time, Russia continued to grow in power and prestige, and the nation was finally considered to be one of the great powers of Europe under the reign of Catherine the Great. Now, funny thing about Catherine, she wasn't Russian. She was German. She was born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst and married the next in line to the Russian throne in the year 1745. When her husband became Tsar, well, she put together a conspiracy, overthrew him, and declared herself to be the Empress. Loving marriage. Anyway, after Catherine's rule, the power of Russia started to wane, because in many ways, Russian society was behind that of their European peers. Serfdom and some remnants of feudalism lasted in Russia all the way until 1861, for goodness sake. Despite the Russian government lagging behind that of the rest of Europe, and the fact that the country was not industrializing as fast as the rest of the world, Russia was still seen as one of the great powers of Europe, and was a key ally of the United Kingdom and France at the outset of the First World War. But because of the strain put on the nation during the war, the Russian people revolted, and the Russian Empire collapsed in the middle of the war. Due to the revolution, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, and a new provisional government was established to control the country. The provisional government wanted to keep up the war effort, which in turn led to another revolution that brought a man named Vladimir Lenin to power. Lenin was a communist, and the communist ideology believes that private property should be abolished and that labor and goods produced should be owned by the collective, by all. When reading about pure communism, it is easy to see why that ideology was popular, especially in Russia. The Russian people were, for the most part, extremely poor, and the idea that people were to share the wealth of the nation and working for the common good must have seemed like a pretty appealing idea. The problem, however, is how do you enforce this system? Well, there needs to be a dictatorship, and when there is a dictatorship, corruption is inevitable. Now, because Lenin wanted to set up his new communist state as an example for the world, he wanted Russia out of the war as soon as possible. Because of this, he agreed to extremely harsh terms imposed on Russia by the Germans to end the war, and gave up much of Russia's territory in Eastern Europe. Vladimir Lenin and his fellow Bolsheviks were now free to recreate Russia as a communist country. Well, only after they won the Russian Civil War, which they did. Under Lenin's leadership, the Russian Empire became the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, which would eventually morph into the Union of Soviet socialist republics. The USSR, or Soviet Union, became the world's first communist state. Lenin did not live long after the revolution, however, and it was one Joseph Stalin that went on to become the Soviet Union's new leader. While many believed Lenin to be genuinely concerned with building and growing communism, Stalin was more concerned with building and growing his own power. Stalin oversaw a reign of terror within the Soviet Union, and many people that opposed him were sent to prisons in the middle of Siberia, or worse. To gain some of the old land that Russia had lost after the First World War, Stalin actually came to an agreement with Hitler to divide up Poland between the two countries, and he was perfectly content with that plan until Hitler turned on him and the Soviets.
Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep going." "But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine, keep going." "We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal, keep going." Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end.
Thanks to the sheer willpower of the Soviet people and the USSR as a whole, the Germans had to fall back, and the end of Nazi Germany was now inevitable. After the war, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two most powerful countries in the world. And after the war, the Soviet Union occupied much of Eastern Europe, all the way to Berlin in Germany. And, well, they didn't leave. Instead, the Soviets set up communist puppet states in Eastern Europe that were basically vassals of the Soviet Union. The United States would then gather a number of democratic capitalist states and form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, to counter Russian aggression in the East. In response, the Soviet Union then created the Warsaw Pact to counter NATO. This conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union would eventually be called the Cold War. There was no fighting between the two, they just continually tried to keep one-upping each other. Both countries developed new weapons to destroy one another, and to this day, both the US and Russia have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. Because either country could easily destroy the other, this kept either side from ever attacking the other. This was called mutually assured destruction. Any attack on one would likely end in the destruction of both. The two were also competing in technology. The Soviet Union was the first nation to send a man into space, which the US responded to by putting a man on the moon. Anyway, this competition led to financial hardships in the Soviet Union. The USSR simply could not afford to keep up with the United States. In the late 1980s, communism started to collapse, with some of the Eastern European countries renouncing communism and becoming democratic states. Even parts of the USSR were starting to declare independence. The Soviet Union finally came to an end in 1991 when the nations of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia all declared independence, and the red banner was lowered from the Kremlin, and the Russian tricolor was raised. Unfortunately for the Russian people, the fall of the Soviet Union did not bring democracy to the country. While the first president, Boris Yeltsin, was indeed democratically elected, the next president, Vladimir Putin, went on to undermine Russian democracy and set himself up as a dictator. He has also sought to expand Russian power throughout Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and has even invaded countries like Ukraine and Georgia to expand Russian power. While the government of Russia today is no friend to the United States and democracy in general, it is important to remember that the Russian people are not Vladimir Putin, and many simply want to live their lives in freedom. I think I speak for everyone when I say that I hope the Russian people will someday have a truly democratic system, and soon. I will leave you with this. Россия вперед! Forward, Russia!